The first sound of the morning was Caleb Foster falling out of bed, not gracefully, not with dignity. He hit the hardwood floor of Julian Reed's Beacon Street apartment with a thud that rattled the water glass on the nightstand, followed by a groan so wounded you'd think he'd been shot. "I'm fine," Caleb announced to no one from the floor, face down in the rug. "Everyone stay calm." Julian didn't even open his eyes. "You're the only one panicking. There's a whole war happening under this blanket, Julian. I was ambushed. That war is called you stealing the comforter at 4 a.m., and I've filed my formal surrender." A pause. Then Caleb's head popped up over the edge of the mattress, hair sticking up in 7 directions, eyes narrowed with the particular offense of a man who had just lost an argument he started. In the gray wash of early light through the blinds, he looked less like the hospital's top anesthesiologist and more like a golden retriever that had gotten into the coffee. Julian had loved him for 2 years and some months, and this exact, ridiculous, undignified face was still, infuriatingly, the best thing he saw most mornings. "You're smiling," Caleb accused. "I'm not. You're doing the thing with your mouth." "I don't have a thing." "You have a thing, Dr. Reed, and it is extremely unprofessional for a man who spent an hour last week lecturing me about professional detachment in high-stress environments." Julian sat up, dragging a hand through his hair, and reached for his phone on the nightstand. 5:42 a.m., plenty of time. He had scrubs to iron, a to-go mug to fill, and exactly one very tall, very loud anesthesiologist to get out the door before either of them was late for the same hospital, where their relationship was still, officially, a secret held together by strategically timed elevator rides and separate parking levels. "Up," Julian said, swinging his legs out of bed. "Whitmore's doing the surgical briefing at 6:30. If Vanessa gets there before us and starts telling people we were stuck in traffic together again, that was one time. You said it in front of 3 residents, Caleb." They were very supportive. Julian was already in the bathroom, brushing his teeth with the efficient, joyless speed of a man who had done this exact routine 400 times, when he heard Caleb rummaging through the dresser like a raccoon in a campsite. "Where," Caleb called, "are all my socks?" "In your drawer. There is one single sock in my drawer, and it does not have a partner, and I refuse to accept this injustice before coffee." Julian rinsed, wiped his mouth, and leaned into the doorway. Caleb was standing in the middle of the room in dress pants and no shirt, holding up one lonely navy sock like it was Exhibit A in a murder trial. It was, Julian noted with some private, helpless fondness, exactly the kind of scene that made it very hard to keep pretending, at work, that he didn't want to put his hand on the back of this man's neck every time he walked past him in a hallway. "Left drawer," Julian said. "You put half your stuff in my dresser in March and never told me. That's called moving in, Julian. It's a normal human milestone. You moved your socks in, not yourself." Semantics. Socks are the vanguard. The rest of me is a formality that follows the socks wherever they lead. That is not how moving in works. It is if you love someone enough. Julian gave up arguing, because arguing with Caleb Foster before 6 in the morning was a battle no one had ever won, least of all Julian, who had tried and failed for 2 straight years. He tossed a matching sock from the left drawer at Caleb's head, which Caleb caught out of the air with the reflexes of a man whose entire job depended on hand-eye coordination under pressure, and pulled it on with a triumphant little flourish. "See," Caleb said. "Solved. I'm basically a detective. You're basically a man who can't find his own socks, a detective who solves sock crimes. Niche market. Very underserved." "Come here," Julian said, sighing, and reached for the tie hanging loose around Caleb's neck. He looped it, crossed it, tucked it, and then, at the very last second, pulled the knot half an inch too tight and tugged it crooked, just enough to be noticeable, just enough to be deniable. That felt intentional. It was muscle memory. "You don't have crooked tie muscle memory, Julian. You iron your socks." "I do not iron my socks. You've considered it. I've seen the look in your eyes near the ironing board. It's the same look serial killers get near knife blocks in true crime documentaries. If I were going to murder you, Caleb, I promise you it would not be with an iron." See, that's the kind of sentence that would sound a lot less alarming from anyone else. 10 minutes later, they were both dressed, Caleb's tie slightly crooked because Julian had fixed it wrong on purpose just to watch him complain, and standing in the tiny kitchen sharing one to-go mug of coffee because Caleb had, in his infinite chaos, put the second mug through the dishwasher's heating cycle twice and cracked it clean down the handle. "You're going to walk in 5 minutes after me." Julian said, checking his badge was clipped straight. Different door, like always. One day, Caleb said, stealing the mug back for one more sip. I am going to walk into that OR, kiss you in front of the entire surgical team, and let Whitmore have the aneurysm instead of the senator. Julian huffed something that was almost a laugh. It was such an ordinary morning. Coffee too hot, one sock missing its match. Caleb's mouth curved into that lazy, teasing smile that had, somehow over 2 years, become the softest place in Julian's whole exhausting life. He had no idea, walking out the door into the cold Boston morning, that it was May 14th again. He had no idea that in 6 months, in a version of this day he would never get to live twice. A truck would end his life on Starro Drive with Caleb's name still unsent in a text message on his phone. He just grabbed his keys, kissed Caleb quickly by the door where the neighbors couldn't see, and went to work. The déjà vu hit him somewhere between the parking garage and the 7th floor conference room, and by the time Julian sat down at the long mahogany table in the Department of Surgery, it wasn't déjà vu anymore. It was memory. The smell got him first, bleach and iodine, and the particular burnt coffee smell of the machine in the corner that had never once worked right. Then the light, flat and fluorescent, humming faintly overhead. Then the iPad in front of him, already open to a patient file he hadn't pulled up yet. Senator Charles Whitfield. Abdominal aortic aneurysm. High risk of rupture. Julian's hand went on instinct to his ribs, bracing for the crush of impact, the shriek of an 18-wheeler's horn, the last blinding wash of headlights on Starro Drive. There was nothing. Just the crisp weight of his white coat and his own heartbeat slamming too hard against his sternum. The date in the corner of the screen read May 14th. The clock beside it read 6:32 a.m. I died, Julian thought, with a strange, floating calm, the way you think a fact you already know by heart. I died in November. Caleb found out over the phone, because I never told him I loved him first. And now it's May again. So, Dr. Reed. Dr. Gerald Whitmore's voice rolled across the table like weather, booming, self-satisfied, entirely too pleased with itself for 6:30 in the morning. 58 years old, silver hair combed into submission, Chief of Surgery at Somerset General for 11 years, and proud owner of an ego that took up more space in any room than his actual body did. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and folded his hands. As discussed, Vanessa will take the lead on the proximal clamping tomorrow. Real hands-on experience on a complex case. Good for her file. Beside him, twirling a gold pen between manicured fingers, sat Dr. Vanessa Whitmore, 27, third-year surgical resident, the chief's niece, and, in the private ranking system, every attending on the floor kept in their head, exactly one hemorrhage away from a lawsuit. She had a smirk on her mouth that Julian remembered with total, sickening clarity, because he had watched that same mouth go slack with horror 6 months later, watched those same manicured fingers drop a set of forceps into an open abdominal cavity, while a United States senator bled out under her hands. So Dr. Reed, Vanessa echoed, sweet as poisoned honey. Any objections? I've run the clamp sequence on the simulator a dozen times. You'll just be there to watch my back. In his first life, Julian had swallowed his doubts and let her scrub in, because Whitmore was the chief and Whitmore's word was practically scripture in this building. He remembered exactly how it went, her hands shaking, the artery tearing, the alarm screaming, himself elbow-deep in blood fighting a battle that had already been lost the moment they let an unsteady hand near a knife-edge vessel. He remembered signing the incident report Whitmore shoved in front of him afterward, remembered the particular way Whitmore had smiled while threatening his little brother's chemo coverage if Julian didn't take the fall. A slow, cold clarity settled over him now, replacing the panic completely. It felt almost peaceful. No, Julian said. The pen stopped twirling. No? Whitmore's frown deepened, leaning forward. Reed, this was cleared with the board. Vanessa is ready. I'm not asking permission. I'm informing you of the operative plan. Julian stood, chair legs scraping loud against the tile, and unclipped the hospital ID from his lapel. It landed on the mahogany with a sharp, final little clack, right in the space between Whitmore's folded hands and Vanessa's gold pen. I'm not saying no to Vanessa doing the clamping. He held Whitmore's stare without blinking. I'm saying no to the surgery. I resign. Effective immediately. The silence that followed had weight to it, like the air right before a thunderclap. Excuse me? Whitmore's face went a deep mottled red. It's not a tantrum, Gerald, Julian said, already moving toward the door, voice even and almost gentle. It's a formal resignation, HR and legal will have the email within the hour. By the time I reach the parking lot, I no longer work here. You're under contract." Whitmore was on his feet now, palms slamming the table. "Walk out that door and I will personally see you blacklisted from every hospital in this state." Julian paused at the doorway, one hand on the frame, and looked back with something almost like pity. "Check my contract, Gerald. I'm at will." A small, terrible smile. "And 10 minutes before this meeting, I transferred Senator Whitfield's care to you in the EMR system. You're the physician of record now. Good luck tomorrow. I hear that aneurysm is sitting awfully close to the renal arteries." He hadn't transferred anything yet, but his phone was already in his hand as he walked out, thumb moving before the door had even swung shut behind him, and for the first time in what felt like 6 months and one entire lifetime, Julian Reed felt like he could breathe. He made it as far as the stairwell before his hands started shaking. Not from doubt, from the sheer, dizzying vertigo of having said the thing out loud, the thing he'd rehearsed 1,000 times in a life that had ended on Starro Drive with the words still unsaid. He sat down on the concrete step, opened the EMR app, and with a few precise taps, made the lie true. Care of Senator Charles Whitfield, transferred to Dr. Gerald Whitmore, Chief of Surgery, time-stamped 6:22 a.m., 10 minutes before the meeting had even started. He'd backdated the intent, if not quite the letter, and he found, with some surprise, that he didn't feel guilty about it at all. He found Caleb exactly where he expected to, leaning against the frame of the surgical locker room with a lukewarm coffee in one hand, scrolling something on his phone with the particular scowl of a man reading hospital email at 7 in the morning. "There he is," Caleb said, not looking up. "I heard a rumor that Dr. Reed just torched the department in front of the entire surgical board, and I said, no, that can't be right. My boyfriend would never start a fire he didn't have an exit plan for. I quit, Caleb." That got him to look up. Julian was already pulling his stethoscope and a spare set of scrubs off the shelf, stuffing them into his duffel with hands that weren't quite steady, no matter how calm his voice had sounded in that conference room. Caleb crossed the room in 3 steps, coffee forgotten on the bench, and caught Julian's wrist, not hard, just enough to make him stop. "Hey." His voice had dropped all the way down, all the humor gone out of it. "Julian, what is going on? You don't walk away from a case." "You didn't even walk away when you had the flu and a fever of 102. I had to physically stand in a doorway. I need you to do something for me." Julian's throat was tight. 6 months of memory pressed up behind his ribs. Every accusation, every threat, the exact sound of Vanessa's voice cracking under interrogation, the exact sound of his own voice on the phone telling Caleb, too late, everything he should have said in person. "Tomorrow morning, get yourself reassigned. Peds, the ICU, a broom closet, I don't care. Just do not, under any circumstances, set foot in or for Julian. Please." It came out cracked, more raw than he meant to let it, and Caleb's whole face changed, the teasing gone, replaced by something quiet and searching and afraid. "If you're in that room tomorrow, it's not just your career that burns. I can't." He stopped. Swallowed. Started again, quieter. "I can't lose you in there. I won't survive that a second time." Caleb didn't ask what a second time meant. Later, Julian would understand that this was the moment he fell in love with him all over again, in this new version of the day. Not because Caleb solved anything, or demanded an explanation, or made a joke to break the tension the way he always did. He simply set his coffee down, took Julian's face in both hands, thumbs brushing along his jaw the way he did on the worst nights, and pressed their foreheads together. "Okay," Caleb said simply. "I trust you. I don't know what you're not telling me. And I'm not going to make you say it, standing in a locker room at 7 in the morning. But I trust you, Julian. So I'm going to go find Dr. Alvarez in Peds this afternoon and beg her to trade me a shift. And I'm not going near that or tomorrow, not even to grab a coffee from the machine outside it." Something in Julian's chest, something that had been clenched tight since he opened his eyes at that mahogany table and understood he'd been given a day he shouldn't have, finally quietly let go. He exhaled against Caleb's mouth, and Caleb kissed him, soft and unhurried, right there where anyone could walk in, and for once neither of them cared. "I'm going to tell you everything," Julian whispered against his lips. "Just, not today. Today I need you safe. Tonight I'll tell you the whole impossible thing. I'm holding you to that." Caleb's thumb traced his cheekbone once, gentle. "And Julian, whatever you're about to do to Whitmore, make it hurt." For the first time all morning, Julian actually smiled, the real one, the one Caleb always accused him of hiding. "Oh," he said, shouldering his duffel, "I intend to." He was almost at the door when Caleb caught his sleeve one more time. "For what it's worth," Caleb said, quieter now, "whatever this is, whatever you're carrying, you don't have to carry it alone this time, whichever life this is." Julian didn't trust his voice enough to answer that. He just nodded and left, and didn't look back until he was in the parking garage, where he allowed himself exactly 30 seconds to lean against his car and breathe before he opened his phone and started making calls. By 8 that evening, Julian's phone had become a small, glowing brick of other people's panic, buzzing itself across the kitchen counter like it was trying to escape. He let it. 34 missed calls from Gerald Whitmore, 19 from Vanessa, 5 from HR, 2 from a legal extension he didn't recognize. "You could turn that off, you know," Caleb said, from the stove, where he was doing something to a pan of garlic and olive oil that smelled significantly better than it had any right to, given that Caleb Foster's usual culinary range topped out at cereal and confidence. "Just a thought. From your live-in boyfriend. Who is currently cooking for you," which is a sentence I never thought I'd say. I like watching them panic. Julian poured 2 glasses of wine and slid one across the counter. "It's educational. It's unhinged, is what it is, but I respect the growth." Caleb clinked his glass against Julian's, then leaned in and stole a kiss that tasted like garlic and red wine, which should not have worked and somehow, on him, did. "So, you promised me the whole impossible thing." Julian looked at him for a long moment, at the flower on his sleeve, the too big grin, the eyes that had gone soft and patient and utterly unafraid, and decided that whatever happened tomorrow, whatever the fallout looked like, he wasn't going to spend this life keeping secrets from the one person who'd earned the truth in a locker room that morning without even asking for it. "I've lived this day before," Julian said quietly. He told him all of it. The truck, the 18-wheeler. 6 months of malpractice suits, and a stolen medical license, and a brother's chemo treatment held hostage by a man who considered blackmail a management strategy. He told him about the version of tomorrow where he'd sat alone with the senator's CT scans until 2 a.m., about the phone call he never got to make in time, about dying with Caleb's name unsent in a draft text that read, "Only there's something I should have told you." Caleb had gone very still by the time he finished, wine untouched, jaw tight. Then, instead of asking if Julian was insane, instead of demanding proof, he simply reached across the counter and threaded their fingers together. "So this whole day," Caleb said slowly, "the socks, the coffee, the meeting, you've been carrying 6 months of grief since about 6:30 this morning, something like that. And you still made time to fix my tie wrong on purpose." Despite everything, Julian laughed, a real, startled sound. "I regret nothing." Caleb pulled him around the counter and into his arms, tucking Julian's head under his chin the way he did on nights when the ICU had been particularly brutal, and for a long minute neither of them said anything at all. Just the low simmer of the pan, the hum of the fridge, the particular safety of being held by someone who had chosen, without hesitation, to believe him. "Whatever you need from me," Caleb murmured into his hair, "for whatever comes tomorrow, I'm in it, all the way in it." Later, after the pasta had gone cold and been reheated twice, and Caleb had fallen half asleep against his shoulder on the couch, Julian sat up with his laptop and did the one thing his first life had never given him time to do. He went looking for a reason. Not just Whitmore's ego, not just Vanessa's inexperience. A reason a man like Gerald Whitmore would risk a sitting senator's life rather than simply postpone a surgery or call in someone more qualified. Men that arrogant were rarely just arrogant. They usually had something to protect. He started with 3 years of OR scheduling logs, cross-referenced against billing codes he had access to as an attending, and found the first thread almost by accident. A surgery 18 months prior where Whitmore was billed as primary attending for a 6-hour procedure while the anesthesia log, pulled from the same shift, placed him in a completely different building at a conference in Providence. He didn't understand yet what it meant. He only knew, with the particular instinct of a man who had already lived through what came next, that it was worth pulling the thread further before tomorrow. His phone buzzed against the counter, a new text, from an unknown number. "Dr. Reed, this is Vanessa. Please, you have to come back. Uncle Gerald says his arthritis is acting up. No one else will scrub in on short notice. He's making me do the primary incision. I don't know the anatomical variants for the infrarenal clamp. Please." Julian read it twice, screenshotted it, and uploaded it to a cloud folder labeled with grim humor, evidence. That her? Caleb asked, reading over his shoulder, blinking himself awake. That's her. Julian set the phone face down, panicking exactly on schedule. Caleb pressed a kiss to his temple. You're terrifying when you're plotting revenge. I love it. I love you. It was the first time either of them had said it out loud, and it landed in the middle of a kitchen that smelled like garlic and second chances. Entirely unplanned, entirely true. I love you too, Julian said, and meant it more than he had ever meant anything in either of his lives. He stayed up another 2 hours after Caleb went to bed, quietly building his folder, the resignation letter, the EMR transfer log, Vanessa's message, and a growing, half-formed suspicion about Whitmore's billing history that he didn't yet have proof for, only a feeling in his gut that had never once been wrong. At 5:30 the next morning, Julian was sitting in a small cafe directly across from Somerset General, laptop open, dressed sharp in a navy blazer, a cup of espresso cooling by his elbow. He wasn't hiding, he was waiting for a meeting. His phone buzzed. Caleb, from a call room 3 floors up in a different wing entirely, technically at work and technically nowhere near OR4. Traded my whole day for peds like you asked. Madhouse up here already. Whitmore tried to force Ramirez to take the case. Ramirez threatened to call the medical board. Whitmore's scrubbing in himself. Vanessa looks like she's going to be sick. Keep me updated, Julian typed back. Has he been rolled in yet? Yes. Just went under. Making the initial incision now. A chill went down his spine even though he'd known this was coming. Known it for 6 months and 1 whole death. Dr. Reed? He looked up. Standing at his table was Dr. Preston Cole, 51, sharp-eyed, no-nonsense chief medical officer of Beacon Hill Medical Center, the elite hospital across town that had been trying to poach Julian for 3 years, with increasingly generous offers and increasingly early phone calls. Dr. Cole. Thanks for meeting me at this hour. When the best vascular surgeon in Boston calls me at midnight and says he's a free agent, I clear my morning. Preston took the seat across from him, studying him with open curiosity. Word is you were scheduled to operate on Senator Whitfield this morning. Whitmore doesn't usually let anyone near his high-profile cases. Dr. Whitmore and I have a fundamental disagreement about patient safety, Julian said evenly, sliding his laptop around so Preston could see the resignation letter, already drafted, already dated. I won't compromise my oath for the sake of his nepotism. I resigned yesterday morning. Beacon Hill has always prided itself on meritocracy. That's why I'm here. Preston's eyebrows went up. Nepotism. The Whitmore girl. I've heard rumors. They're not rumors. Julian's phone buzzed again. Caleb. Trouble. Aneurysms bigger than the scans showed. Tissues friable. This isn't going well. Julian kept his expression perfectly level and turned back to Preston. If I join Beacon Hill, I bring a 0% mortality rate on elective aortic procedures. In exchange, I want full autonomy over my surgical team and veto power on any resident assigned to my OR. Done. Preston was already pulling a folder from his briefcase. Frankly, Julian, Somerset's loss is our very fortunate gain. Let's talk numbers. As Preston walked him through the contract terms, base salary, research budget, a research fellowship named after him within 5 years if his outcomes held, Julian's phone buzzed against the table in short, frantic bursts. Whitmore's hands are shaking too bad. He's handing the clamps to Vanessa. Oh God, code blue, massive hemorrhage. She clamped the renal artery. It tore, BP's tanking. 60/40. 40/20. They're pushing transfusions, but it's pouring out of him. They're doing compressions. Julian, it's bad up here. He stared at the screen, the phantom smell of blood filling his nose even though he was sitting in a cafe that smelled like espresso and cinnamon rolls. Some part of him, the part that had sworn an oath, the part that had spent a decade learning to save people, ached for the man on that table. But he knew, with total certainty, that if he'd walked back into that building this morning, Whitmore would have found a way to put the knife in his hand instead, and it would be Julian's career burning down alongside theirs. He had already lived that version. He was not going to live it twice. Everything all right, Dr. Reed? Preston asked, noting his fixed stare. Perfectly fine. Julian looked up, picked up the pen, and signed his name at the bottom of the Beacon Hill contract. The ink had barely dried when the wail of an ambulance siren tore down the street outside, headed straight for Somerset General's emergency bay. For the first time in 2 lifetimes, Julian Reed felt completely, utterly bulletproof. Preston shook his hand, gathered the signed contract, and paused halfway out of his chair. One more thing before I go. HR flagged something odd in the transfer paperwork on my end. An unusually thorough billing history request routed through Somerset's records office last night, under your credentials. Anything I should know about before you're officially one of ours. Julian only smiled, the same small, unreadable smile he'd worn walking out of that conference room. Just due diligence, Dr. Cole. I like to know exactly what kind of house I'm walking away from before I hand someone the keys to burn it down. Preston laughed, clearly assuming it was a joke, and left him to his coffee. The television above the barista's counter cut away from the morning show at exactly 9:42 a.m. A red banner slid across the bottom of the screen. The anchor's face had gone grim in the particular way reserved for very bad news about very important people. Senator Charles Whitfield, a fixture of Massachusetts politics for 2 decades, has been pronounced dead following complications during a scheduled surgery at Somerset General Hospital. Julian set his cup down. It clicked softly against the saucer. Around him, the cafe rippled with low murmurs, phones coming out, heads shaking. He closed his laptop, thanked Preston Cole for his time, and walked out into the cool morning air. Across the street, the sirens had stopped, replaced by the swarm of news vans already circling like gulls. He went home. Caleb met him at the door, still in scrubs, face pale, and didn't say anything, just pulled him inside and held on. And Julian let himself be held, because grief for a man he couldn't save and relief that it hadn't been Caleb bleeding out on that table could apparently exist in the same body at the same time without tearing him in half. I heard it from 3 different people before I even got my coat off, Caleb said into his shoulder, voice muffled. They're saying Vanessa's the one who tore the renal artery. They're saying Whitmore couldn't even hold the retractor steady. I keep thinking, if you hadn't made me trade my shift. Don't. Julian pulled back just enough to look at him. Don't do that. You didn't do anything. You're allowed to just be glad you're safe. I am glad. Caleb's jaw worked. I'm also furious and sad and a little bit terrified of you, if I'm honest, because you knew. You knew, and you still made it look effortless. It wasn't effortless. I've just had 6 months to rehearse. They slept for most of the day, tangled together, phones off. It was the first time in what felt like 6 months that Julian didn't dream about headlights. When he turned his phone back on that evening, his inbox was a war zone. Legal threats from Somerset's HR department, a wave of bewildered messages from colleagues, and at the top, a formal summons from Arthur Langley, Somerset General's chief legal counsel, ordering him to appear before an emergency review board at 2 o'clock the following afternoon. They're going to try to pin it on you, Caleb said, reading over his shoulder, jaw tight. I know their playbook. Julian was already pulling a leather folder out of his desk drawer, the one he'd spent the night compiling instead of sleeping, 6 months of hard-won knowledge condensed into 48 hours of preparation, plus the loose thread on Whitmore's billing history he'd started pulling the night before. I lived it once. Not again. Caleb caught his hand before he could stand. Let me come with you. You can't. It'll look like collusion, and I need you clean for what happens after. Julian pressed a kiss to his knuckles. But I promise you, when I walk out of that boardroom tomorrow, it's going to be the last time either of us ever has to be afraid of that man. He spent most of the night at the kitchen table with 3 laptops open, cross-referencing anesthesia logs against Whitmore's surgical calendar going back 3 years, the same thread he'd started pulling the night before. What had begun as a hunch, one conference in Providence that didn't line up, unraveled into something far bigger the longer he looked. A pattern of surgeries billed under Whitmore's name, where the actual attending, based on anesthesia and nursing sign-in records, had clearly been someone else. Usually Vanessa, usually with none of her name anywhere on the paperwork that mattered for reimbursement. By 4 in the morning he had 11 confirmed discrepancies and a very good idea of what he was looking at. Walking into Somerset General the next afternoon felt like a different life entirely, which, Julian supposed, it technically was. He wasn't a condemned man walking to the gallows this time. He was an executioner walking into the courtyard, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, hair combed back, files tucked under one arm like a weapon. The boardroom on the top floor was suffocating. Arthur Langley sat at the head of the table, face a mask of cold fury. Beside him, Whitmore looked 10 years older than he had 2 days prior, gray-skinned, bloodshot, hands flat on the table in a failed attempt to hide the tremor. Vanessa was nowhere to be seen. Dr. Reed. Langley's voice dripped venom. How gracious of you to join us. I trust you've seen the news. I have. Julian took the only empty chair at the far end of the table and didn't open his folder yet, just folded his hands and waited. Skip the pleasantries, Whitmore snapped, leaning forward, finger shaking as he pointed. You walked out on a critical patient. You abandoned Senator Whitfield. Because of your negligence, a man is dead. The board is filing a complaint with the State Medical Council to revoke your license and forwarding your file to the DA. Julian let the silence sit for a long, deliberate beat, letting the threat echo off the walls before he answered. Criminal negligence, he said, raising one eyebrow. Fascinating accusation, Gerald. Let's examine the timeline. He opened the folder and slid the first sheet down the table to Langley. At 6:22 in the morning on May 14th, 10 minutes before the surgical briefing began, I formally transferred Senator Whitfield's care to you, Gerald, in the EMR. He met Whitmore's eyes. At 6:40, I submitted a formal, unconditional resignation, citing a hostile work environment and ethical concerns regarding the Chief of Surgery. I have the digital timestamp and the IP log proving the transfer was accepted from your office terminal at 6:25. You manipulated the system, Whitmore choked out. I never accepted anything. The IT logs disagree. Julian's voice stayed level, almost gentle. My contract, which you were so eager to remind me of, states clearly that I'm an at-will employee. I gave notice. I transferred care to a fully credentialed surgeon, the Chief of Surgery himself. 16 hours before he ever entered the OR, there was no abandonment. The patient was safely in your care from the moment I walked out of that room. Langley adjusted his glasses, flipping through the printouts, and Julian watched the exact moment the man's legal instincts recognized an ironclad defense when he saw one. Be that as it may, Langley said carefully, a jury may view your sudden departure as malicious. We have witnesses prepared to testify you acted vindictively, and I have a witness, Julian said, who'll testify that Dr. Whitmore attempted to force an underqualified resident, his own niece, into a high-risk proximal clamping against the primary attending's explicit medical judgment. He slid a second sheet down the table, the screenshot of Vanessa's text, sent to his phone the night before the surgery. He read it aloud, letting the whole room hear the terror in her written words. Uncle Gerald says he can't do the primary because of his arthritis. He's making me do the incision. I don't know the anatomical variants for the infrarenal clamp. Please. The boardroom erupted. Langley slammed both hands on the table, rounding on Whitmore. You let that girl operate with documented incompetence. You lied to me about your arthritis. It's fabricated, Whitmore roared, standing so fast his chair toppled backward. She invented that message to ruin me. Sent from her verified number, Julian said calmly, routed through the hospital's cellular network. Easily subpoenaed. He held Whitmore's stare, unblinking. You gambled a senator's life on your ego, Gerald, and you lost. Whitmore's breathing had gone ragged, the walls of his careful little empire closing in, but the rat had one last trick left. You think you're clever, Reed, he spat. We have the hospital's legal fund. We will bury you in litigation until you can't afford your rent, let alone a lawyer. We'll paint that text as a forgery and drag your name through every paper in this state. It was, Julian noted with grim satisfaction, almost word for word the threat that had ended his first life. You can try, Gerald. Julian leaned back. But you won't be spending Somerset's legal fund fighting me. You'll be spending it defending yourselves against Renata Kessler. Langley went white as a sheet. Renata Kessler was, at that time, the single most feared malpractice attorney on the Eastern Seaboard. A woman with a nose for institutional rot and a track record of dismantling hospitals down to their foundations. What does Kessler have to do with any of this? Langley's voice had started to shake. Senator Whitfield's widow is a close personal friend of hers, Julian said, checking his watch. 30 minutes ago, a courier delivered a secure drive to her office downtown. It contains my resignation letter, my ethics complaint, the EMR logs, Vanessa's text message. He paused. And something else. Whitmore's face drained entirely of color. 2 nights ago, after I resigned, I couldn't sleep, Julian continued, voice dropping to something almost soft, almost lethal. So instead of lying awake, I pulled every OR schedule and anesthesia log this hospital has generated in the last 3 years, and cross-referenced them against your surgical billing. It took a while. It was worth it. He slid a third stack of paper down the table, thick enough to make a sound when it landed. 11 separate procedures where you were billed to Medicare and to this hospital's insurers as primary attending, while the anesthesia sign-in sheet, which requires a physical signature from whoever is actually in the room, places you somewhere else entirely. A conference in Providence, a golf outing logged on your own calendar. Two of them, the actual surgeon of record, based on nursing notes and post-op documentation, was Vanessa, unsupervised, uncredentialed for procedures of that complexity. Billed at your rate. The silence that followed had the particular suffocating quality of a ship's hull cracking underwater. "Tell me she's lying, Gerald," Langley said, barely audible. "Tell me you didn't commit federal fraud." Whitmore's mouth opened and closed, and no sound came out at all. Julian stood, buttoning his blazer. "Kessler will tear this hospital apart. The federal government will audit this department into the ground. And Vanessa, once investigators offer her a room and 20 years for fraud and involuntary manslaughter of a sitting senator, she'll turn on you before the coffee's cold." He picked up his empty briefcase. "You spent 30 years telling this hospital you were its finest surgeon, Gerald. Turns out you were just its tumor." He didn't wait for the meeting to adjourn. He walked out, the heavy doors clicking shut behind him, sealing the whole rotten thing inside. 2 days later, federal agents raided Somerset General's administrative offices. The footage played on every local station, boxes of files, cloned hard drives. Whitmore led out in handcuffs with his suit jacket pulled up over his face. Vanessa's license was suspended within the hour, and true to Julian's prediction, she cracked under questioning within 48, implicating her uncle in a decade of fraud, negligence, and cover-ups that reduced Somerset General's reputation to ash almost overnight. Julian watched most of it from his own couch, Caleb's legs thrown over his lap, a bowl of popcorn balanced dangerously between them, narrating the news coverage like it was a football game. "Oh, he's crying," Caleb said, delighted, as Whitmore ducked into a federal car. "Look at that. That's the face of a man who thought nepotism was a permanent condition. You're enjoying this too much." "I watched that man make my boyfriend's hands shake for 6 months in a life I'm apparently not supposed to remember," Caleb said, stealing a handful of popcorn. "So yes, actually, I'm going to enjoy every single second of it. You weren't there for those 6 months. You're not allowed to be traumatized on my behalf. I'm choosing to be traumatized retroactively. It's called solidarity." Julian laughed, and it felt strange and good in his chest, laughing about something that had once nearly killed the best part of his life. He reached for another handful of popcorn and let himself, just for a moment, simply enjoy watching the man who had ended one version of him get walked, weeping, into the back of a federal car. The following Monday, Julian walked into Beacon Hill Medical Center for the first time as an employee. The building was all glass and clean lines, sunlight pouring across a lobby that smelled like nothing but coffee and fresh flowers, and Preston Cole met him at the elevator with a badge that read Dr. Julian Reed, Chief of Vascular Surgery. "Feels different, doesn't it?" Preston said, walking him toward the surgical wing. Somerset ran on fear. "We don't do that here. You'll find your team difficult to intimidate and mostly impossible to impress, which I'm told is a compliment where I come from. I can work with that." "Good, because your first case is Thursday, and your resident wants to introduce herself before then. Dr. Priya Nair, top of her class, terrifyingly competent, will absolutely tell you if she thinks you're wrong. I'd be worried if she didn't." Caleb was waiting for him afterward, leaning against a pillar outside with 2 coffees, and the specific grin he wore when he was about to say something that would either be devastatingly sweet or completely unhinged. With Caleb, it was rarely possible to know in advance which. "Chief of Vascular Surgery," he said, handing over a cup. "Look at you. Big important title. Corner office. I hear the view's incredible." "It is." Julian took the coffee, took a slow breath of the crisp evening air, and let it out, 2 lifetimes of dread finally quietly, unclenching from around his ribs. "Caleb, yeah?" "Marry me." Caleb nearly dropped his coffee. "That's Julian, that is not how you—" He laughed, half startled and half something rawer, eyes going bright. "You don't even have a ring. We're standing in a parking garage. I have a very nice apartment with your socks in my dresser, and a life I got a second chance to live, and I am not wasting one more day of it not asking." Julian reached out, brushed a thumb along his jaw, the same gesture Caleb had used on him in that locker room. In that other life he'd never get back and didn't want. "I love you. I loved you enough to die not having told you first, and I am not making that mistake twice. So, marry me. The ring's coming. I promise. For a moment, Caleb just looked at him, really looked, the teasing gone soft around the edges, the whole loud chaotic warmth of him narrowing down to just Julian, standing in a parking garage with 2 cooling coffees, and his whole rewritten future in his hands. "Yeah," Caleb said, voice thick. "Yeah, okay. Obviously, yes." He kissed him right there, in the open, in front of the elevators, in front of anyone who cared to look, and for the first time in either of his lives, Julian didn't think about hiding at all. 14 months later, Julian Reed stood in the kitchen of the house he now, officially, co-owned with one Caleb Foster Reed, staring into the smoking wreckage of what had once been, in theory, a chicken casserole. "It's not that bad," Caleb said from the doorway, still in his work clothes, tie loosened, wedding band catching the kitchen light. "There is a small fire in the oven, Caleb. A very small fire, practically a candle." Julian, in fact, already had the fire extinguisher in hand, a habit he'd developed fully 1 month into married life, after discovering that Caleb Foster Reed, brilliant anesthesiologist, a man who could keep a patient's heart rate stable through a 6-hour aortic repair, could not be trusted alone with a stove for longer than 11 minutes. "This is why I do the cooking," Julian said, dousing the smoldering dish with a short, practiced blast, waving a dish towel at the smoke alarm before it could commit fully to its screaming. "You were busy. I wanted to surprise you. It's our anniversary of the proposal, Julian. That's a real anniversary. I looked it up. There's an app. There is not an app for parking garage proposal anniversaries. There should be." Caleb crossed the kitchen, stepping over the scorched oven mitt on the floor, and slid his arms around Julian's waist from behind, chin hooking over his shoulder to survey the damage together. "In my defense, it looked exactly like the video. Did the video have flames? The video had ambiance." Julian turned in his arms, took in the soot on Caleb's sleeve, the sheepish, unrepentant grin, the same ridiculous face that had once fallen out of bed onto a Boston apartment floor a lifetime, 2 lifetimes, ago, and felt his chest go warm and full in the exact way it always did, no matter how many times he'd already felt it. "We're ordering takeout," Julian said. "Obviously. I already called the Thai place. They know our order by heart now. I think Somchai sends his regards." "Somchai does not know our names." "Somchai," Caleb said, with total wounded sincerity, "and I have a bond." They ended up on the back porch 20 minutes later, a container of drunken noodles balanced between them, the last gold light of evening sliding down over the yard. Somewhere behind them, through the kitchen window, the smoke alarm gave one last apologetic beep and went quiet. Caleb had his sock feet propped on the porch rail, one navy, one gray, deliberately mismatched, a small private joke between them that had somehow survived a proposal, a wedding, and 14 months of marriage without ever once needing an explanation. "No pressure," Caleb said, stealing a piece of chicken off Julian's fork with the casual entitlement of a man who considered married and no personal property boundaries to be synonyms. "But I was thinking. Anniversary trip. Somewhere with a beach. Somewhere Whitmore can't extradite us from. He's in federal prison, Caleb. He's not extraditing anyone. You never know. Man's resourceful. Vindictive people usually are." He grinned around a mouthful of noodles. "So, beach?" "Beach," Julian agreed easily. "Preston's already threatened to fire me if I don't take the vacation days. Something about liability. I like Preston. Preston understands that you are a workaholic who requires management. I am sitting right here. I am managing you. It's a full-time job. I should be paid. You're already the highest paid anesthesiologist in the building, Caleb, and yet, emotionally, criminally underpaid for the managing." Julian looked at him. Soot-smudged sleeve, mismatched socks, wedding band, the whole bright, chaotic, unrepeatable miracle of a second chance he'd never asked for and would never, not for 1 single second of either lifetime, take for granted, and felt the same quiet, unshakable certainty he'd felt walking out of that mahogany boardroom with his badge left behind on the table. He had burned the old life down to build this one. He would do it again in a heartbeat. "Beach." Julian agreed and reached over to steal a noodle right back. "Somewhere with terrible coffee, so you have an excuse to make it yourself and set exactly 1 hotel room on fire instead of our actual kitchen." "That's so romantic," Caleb said, delighted, kissing the corner of his mouth. "I love you too. I didn't say it." "You were about to. I could see it forming. I'm very perceptive. It's the anesthesiologist in me. I read vital signs for a living." "You read my vital signs for a living, apparently. Every single day," Caleb said, softer now, no teasing left in it at all, "for the rest of both our lives, if I have anything to say about it." Which, As your husband, I absolutely do. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked. The smoke alarm, entirely unprompted, beeped one final time in the kitchen, and neither of them got up to check it. They had, after all, gotten very good at knowing exactly which fires were worth putting out, and which ones could simply be left gently to burn themselves out on their own. The first sound of the morning was Caleb Foster falling out of bed, not gracefully, not with dignity. He hit the hardwood floor of Julian Reed's Beacon Street apartment with a thud that rattled the water glass on the nightstand, followed by a groan so wounded you'd think he'd been shot. "I'm fine," Caleb announced to no one from the floor, face down in the rug. "Everyone stay calm." Julian didn't even open his eyes. "You're the only one panicking. There's a whole war happening under this blanket, Julian. I was ambushed. That war is called you stealing the comforter at 4 a.m., and I've filed my formal surrender." A pause. Then Caleb's head popped up over the edge of the mattress, hair sticking up in 7 directions, eyes narrowed with the particular offense of a man who had just lost an argument he started. In the gray wash of early light through the blinds, he looked less like the hospital's top anesthesiologist and more like a golden retriever that had gotten into the coffee. Julian had loved him for 2 years and some months, and this exact, ridiculous, undignified face was still, infuriatingly, the best thing he saw most mornings. "You're smiling," Caleb accused. "I'm not. You're doing the thing with your mouth." "I don't have a thing." "You have a thing, Dr. Reed. And it is extremely unprofessional for a man who spent an hour last week lecturing me about professional detachment in high-stress environments." Julian sat up, dragging a hand through his hair, and reached for his phone on the nightstand. 5:42 a.m., plenty of time. He had scrubs to iron, a to-go mug to fill, and exactly one very tall, very loud anesthesiologist to get out the door before either of them was late for the same hospital, where their relationship was still, officially, a secret held together by strategically timed elevator rides and separate parking levels. "Up," Julian said, swinging his legs out of bed. "Whitmore's doing the surgical briefing at 6:30. If Vanessa gets there before us and starts telling people we were stuck in traffic together again. That was one time. You said it in front of 3 residents, Caleb." They were very supportive. Julian was already in the bathroom, brushing his teeth with the efficient, joyless speed of a man who had done this exact routine 400 times, when he heard Caleb rummaging through the dresser like a raccoon in a campsite. "Where," Caleb called, "are all my socks?" "In your drawer. There is one single sock in my drawer, and it does not have a partner, and I refuse to accept this injustice before coffee." Julian rinsed, wiped his mouth, and leaned into the doorway. Caleb was standing in the middle of the room in dress pants and no shirt, holding up one lonely navy sock like it was Exhibit A in a murder trial. It was, Julian noted with some private, helpless fondness, exactly the kind of scene that made it very hard to keep pretending, at work, that he didn't want to put his hand on the back of this man's neck every time he walked past him in a hallway. "Left drawer," Julian said. "You put half your stuff in my dresser in March and never told me. That's called moving in, Julian. It's a normal human milestone. You moved your socks in, not yourself." Semantics. Socks are the vanguard. The rest of me is a formality that follows the socks wherever they lead. That is not how moving in works. It is if you love someone enough. Julian gave up arguing, because arguing with Caleb Foster before 6 in the morning was a battle no one had ever won, least of all Julian, who had tried and failed for 2 straight years. He tossed a matching sock from the left drawer at Caleb's head, which Caleb caught out of the air with the reflexes of a man whose entire job depended on hand-eye coordination under pressure, and pulled it on with a triumphant little flourish. "See," Caleb said. "Solved. I'm basically a detective. You're basically a man who can't find his own socks, a detective who solves sock crimes. Niche market. Very underserved." "Come here," Julian said, sighing, and reached for the tie hanging loose around Caleb's neck. He looped it, crossed it, tucked it, and then, at the very last second, pulled the knot half an inch too tight and tugged it crooked, just enough to be noticeable, just enough to be deniable. That felt intentional. It was muscle memory. "You don't have crooked tie muscle memory, Julian. You iron your socks." "I do not iron my socks. You've considered it. I've seen the look in your eyes near the ironing board. It's the same look serial killers get near knife blocks in true crime documentaries. If I were going to murder you, Caleb, I promise you it would not be with an iron." See, that's the kind of sentence that would sound a lot less alarming from anyone else. 10 minutes later they were both dressed. Caleb's tie slightly crooked because Julian had fixed it wrong on purpose just to watch him complain, and standing in the tiny kitchen sharing one to-go mug of coffee because Caleb had, in his infinite chaos, put the second mug through the dishwasher's heating cycle twice and cracked it clean down the handle. "You're going to walk in 5 minutes after me," Julian said, checking his badge was clipped straight. "Different door, like always." "One day," Caleb said, stealing the mug back for one more sip, "I am going to walk into that OR, kiss you in front of the entire surgical team, and let Whitmore have the aneurysm instead of the senator." Julian huffed something that was almost a laugh. It was such an ordinary morning. Coffee too hot, one sock missing its match. Caleb's mouth curved into that lazy, teasing smile that had, somehow over 2 years, become the softest place in Julian's whole exhausting life. He had no idea, walking out the door into the cold Boston morning, that it was May 14th again. He had no idea that in 6 months, in a version of this day he would never get to live twice. A truck would end his life on Starro Drive with Caleb's name still unsent in a text message on his phone. He just grabbed his keys, kissed Caleb quickly by the door where the neighbors couldn't see, and went to work. The déjà vu hit him somewhere between the parking garage and the 7th floor conference room, and by the time Julian sat down at the long mahogany table in the Department of Surgery, it wasn't déjà vu anymore. It was memory. The smell got him first, bleach and iodine, and the particular burnt coffee smell of the machine in the corner that had never once worked right. Then the light, flat and fluorescent, humming faintly overhead. Then the iPad in front of him, already open to a patient file he hadn't pulled up yet. Senator Charles Whitfield. Abdominal aortic aneurysm. High risk of rupture. Julian's hand went on instinct to his ribs, bracing for the crush of impact, the shriek of an 18-wheeler's horn, the last blinding wash of headlights on Starro Drive. There was nothing. Just the crisp weight of his white coat and his own heartbeat slamming too hard against his sternum. The date in the corner of the screen read May 14th. The clock beside it read 6:32 a.m. I died, Julian thought, with a strange, floating calm, the way you think a fact you already know by heart. I died in November. Caleb found out over the phone, because I never told him I loved him first. And now it's May again. So, Dr. Reed. Dr. Gerald Whitmore's voice rolled across the table like weather, booming, self-satisfied, entirely too pleased with itself for 6:30 in the morning. 58 years old, silver hair combed into submission, Chief of Surgery at Somerset General for 11 years, and proud owner of an ego that took up more space in any room than his actual body did. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and folded his hands. As discussed, Vanessa will take the lead on the proximal clamping tomorrow. Real hands-on experience on a complex case. Good for her file. Beside him, twirling a gold pen between manicured fingers, sat Dr. Vanessa Whitmore, 27, third-year surgical resident, the chief's niece, and, in the private ranking system, every attending on the floor kept in their head, exactly one hemorrhage away from a lawsuit. She had a smirk on her mouth that Julian remembered with total, sickening clarity, because he had watched that same mouth go slack with horror 6 months later, watched those same manicured fingers drop a set of forceps into an open abdominal cavity, while a United States senator bled out under her hands. "So, Dr. Reed," Vanessa echoed, sweet as poisoned honey. "Any objections?" "I've run the clamp sequence on the simulator a dozen times. You'll just be there to watch my back." In his first life, Julian had swallowed his doubts and let her scrub in, because Whitmore was the chief and Whitmore's word was practically scripture in this building. He remembered exactly how it went, her hand shaking, the artery tearing, the alarm screaming, himself elbow-deep in blood fighting a battle that had already been lost the moment they let an unsteady hand near a knife-edge vessel. He remembered signing the incident report Whitmore shoved in front of him afterward, remembered the particular way Whitmore had smiled while threatening his little brother's chemo coverage if Julian didn't take the fall. A slow, cold clarity settled over him now, replacing the panic completely. It felt almost peaceful. "No," Julian said. The pen stopped twirling. "No?" Whitmore's frown deepened, leaning forward. "Reed, this was cleared with the board. Vanessa is ready. I'm not asking permission. I'm informing you of the operative plan." Julian stood, chair legs scraping loud against the tile, and unclipped the hospital ID from his lapel. It landed on the mahogany with a sharp, final little clack, right in the space between Whitmore's folded hands and Vanessa's gold pen. "I'm not saying no to Vanessa doing the clamping." He held Whitmore's stare without blinking. I'm saying no to the surgery. I resign. Effective immediately. The silence that followed had weight to it, like the air right before a thunderclap. Excuse me? Whitmore's face went a deep mottled red. It's not a tantrum, Gerald, Julian said, already moving toward the door, voice even and almost gentle. It's a formal resignation. HR and legal will have the email within the hour. By the time I reach the parking lot, I no longer work here. You're under contract. Whitmore was on his feet now, palm slamming the table. Walk out that door and I will personally see you blacklisted from every hospital in this state. Julian paused at the doorway, one hand on the frame, and looked back with something almost like pity. Check my contract, Gerald. I'm at will. A small, terrible smile. And 10 minutes before this meeting, I transferred Senator Whitfield's care to you in the EMR system. You're the physician of record now. Good luck tomorrow. I hear that aneurysm is sitting awfully close to the renal arteries. He hadn't transferred anything yet, but his phone was already in his hand as he walked out, thumb moving before the door had even swung shut behind him, and for the first time in what felt like 6 months and one entire lifetime, Julian Reed felt like he could breathe. He made it as far as the stairwell before his hands started shaking. Not from doubt, from the sheer, dizzying vertigo of having said the thing out loud, the thing he'd rehearsed 1,000 times in a life that had ended on Starro Drive with the words still unsaid. He sat down on the concrete step, opened the EMR app, and with a few precise taps, made the lie true. Care of Senator Charles Whitfield, transferred to Dr. Gerald Whitmore, Chief of Surgery, time-stamped 6:22 a.m., 10 minutes before the meeting had even started. He'd backdated the intent, if not quite the letter, and he found, with some surprise, that he didn't feel guilty about it at all. He found Caleb exactly where he expected to, leaning against the frame of the surgical locker room with a lukewarm coffee in one hand, scrolling something on his phone with the particular scowl of a man reading hospital email at 7 in the morning. There he is, Caleb said, not looking up. I heard a rumor that Dr. Reed just torched the department in front of the entire surgical board, and I said, no, that can't be right. My boyfriend would never start a fire he didn't have an exit plan for. I quit, Caleb. That got him to look up. Julian was already pulling his stethoscope and a spare set of scrubs off the shelf, stuffing them into his duffel with hands that weren't quite steady, no matter how calm his voice had sounded in that conference room. Caleb crossed the room in 3 steps, coffee forgotten on the bench, and caught Julian's wrist, not hard, just enough to make him stop. Hey. His voice had dropped all the way down, all the humor gone out of it. Julian, what is going on? You don't walk away from a case. You didn't even walk away when you had the flu and a fever of 102. I had to physically stand in a doorway. I need you to do something for me. Julian's throat was tight. 6 months of memory pressed up behind his ribs. Every accusation, every threat, the exact sound of Vanessa's voice cracking under interrogation, the exact sound of his own voice on the phone telling Caleb, too late, everything he should have said in person. Tomorrow morning, get yourself reassigned. PEDS, the ICU, a broom closet, I don't care. Just do not, under any circumstances, set foot in or for Julian. Please. It came out cracked, more raw than he meant to let it, and Caleb's whole face changed, the teasing gone, replaced by something quiet and searching and afraid. If you're in that room tomorrow, it's not just your career that burns. I can't. He stopped. Swallowed. Started again, quieter. I can't lose you in there. I won't survive that a second time. Caleb didn't ask what a second time meant. Later, Julian would understand that this was the moment he fell in love with him all over again, in this new version of the day. Not because Caleb solved anything, or demanded an explanation, or made a joke to break the tension the way he always did. He simply set his coffee down, took Julian's face in both hands, thumbs brushing along his jaw the way he did on the worst nights, and pressed their foreheads together. Okay, Caleb said simply. I trust you. I don't know what you're not telling me. And I'm not going to make you say it, standing in a locker room at 7 in the morning. But I trust you, Julian. So I'm going to go find Dr. Alvarez in PEDS this afternoon and beg her to trade me a shift. And I'm not going near that OR tomorrow, not even to grab a coffee from the machine outside it. Something in Julian's chest, something that had been clenched tight since he opened his eyes at that mahogany table and understood he'd been given a day he shouldn't have, finally quietly let go. He exhaled against Caleb's mouth, and Caleb kissed him, soft and unhurried, right there where anyone could walk in, and for once neither of them cared. I'm going to tell you everything, Julian whispered against his lips. Just, not today. Today I need you safe. Tonight I'll tell you the whole impossible thing. I'm holding you to that. Caleb's thumb traced his cheekbone once, gentle. And Julian, whatever you're about to do to Whitmore, make it hurt. For the first time all morning, Julian actually smiled. The real one. The one Caleb always accused him of hiding. Oh, he said, shouldering his duffel, I intend